Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today we're reviewing the new album from the Melvins, A Walk with Love and Death. Melvins are just, a legendary group in terms of metal music, sludge metal music, and of course helping popularize grunge music as well. They were kind of coming out around that time when that music was starting to become popular, of course influencing bands like Nirvana when they were first, coming onto the scene. But of course Melvins had a bit of a heavier sound to them, kind of making more of that sludge metal sound like I was saying earlier, having doom metal influences in there, hardcore punk influences in there. And this band, of course, aside from being just, a massively influential band in terms of that genre of music and just, music in general as a result of that, they have a lot of albums under their belt at this point, and they're a group that I enjoy a good amount, to be quite honest. And, it's kind of surprising that this album here is their first double album throughout all the albums that they've released so far. You'd think a band with this many albums maybe would have thought to release a double album up to this point, but no, this is the first one we've gotten so far. And it's split up into two separate parts, Death and Love. And now, a kind of confusing thing about this is, when listening to this album online through Spotify, Death was listed first, followed by Love, yet everywhere else I kind of see it, the track listing lists Love before Death, so, I really don't know which order is the right one, though I would think Love coming before Death would make a bit more sense, considering in the title of the album, Love does come before Death, so, I'm not exactly sure. But if there's one thing I do know is that these two halves, or these two parts of this album, this double album that is, are very different from one another. Death is more of a typical Melvins album, whereas Love is a bit more of an experimental sort of soundtrack that is meant to accompany a short film that's being released, I believe, later on. I believe the film is also called the same title as this album, but, I haven't actually seen that film. Like I said, I believe it's not released yet. It's a short film, and just, I'm going to talk about Love first, because I don't think I have all too much to say about it, is just on its own, it's not exactly a project that I think is super interesting or super enjoyable to listen to, considering it's just a bunch of experimental noise, ambient sounds, sound clips that are possibly taken from whatever film this is going to be soundtracking, in that film. It's just it seems like a bunch of nonsense when you listen to it at times, and there are some hints of, actual musical parts in there, but for the most part, listening to this entire, pretty much album length of soundtrack is definitely not a task for, the casual fan of this band. I think really this is something that hardcore fans may enjoy and should definitely listen to. But then again, even the hardcore fans, maybe, this may not be quite up your alley considering just what it is and just the sort of sound that it has. It doesn't quite sound like anything the Melvins have put out, which could be considered to be a good thing, of course, because it is different, it is experimental for sure, and, this band hasn't strayed away from experimentation throughout all their albums, but this is definitely something so different that many people may not quite enjoy it. But at the same time, kind of reviewing it without the context of the actual film that it's a part of is a bit difficult. I feel like if I had seen it in the context of whatever film it's going to be accompanying, I would be able to comment on it a bit further. But as of just listening to this on its own, I mean, it's interesting listening to it through the first time, but after that, I don't really see much of a reason to be listening to this, on its own. It's not something I think I'll ever really be coming back to on its own. And even just over the course of listening to this project, I was listening to Death a lot more on its own than I was just Love. I listened to Love about a couple times, and that's really all I could take of listening to this, what seems to be almost nonsense at times. And I'm certain, given in the context of the film, it's quite not nonsense, but just listening to it on its own, it does seem that way a lot. And it's definitely not really enjoyable to listen to, but, it is, for what it is, it's definitely an interesting project, I'll give it that. It's experimental, it's interesting, it's just not something I think I'll really be listening to. On the other hand, Death, like I said earlier, is a bit more of a typical Melvins album, with, more typical Melvins sound, and just a more typical, album structure in general. It has more of actual songs on it. And before talking about Death itself, I just want to say that the pairing of Love and Death here, these two parts into this one double album, just kind of confuses me to an extent, because like I said earlier, I think a double album coming from the Melvins would be really interesting, but, when it uses these two pretty much very separate parts that are, very different from each other and don't seem to connect all that much, it just kind of makes it feel like these two projects were kind of slapped together as a double album. Like I said, I think this would have worked out better had Death been released kind of as its own album, because it definitely could have stood that way. And if Love had been released also as its own album, just as a soundtrack, because having this be released as a double album makes it a bit misleading because, technically you're getting one full Melvins album, but at the same time you're also getting a soundtrack, which was made by them, but it's definitely something different, not something that you'd really expect from this band if you really weren't in the know as to what was going to be here on this project. But talking about Death, I think Death is a really enjoyable album here, or at least half of this album. It's definitely not quite as heavy as some of the material that the Melvins have put out in the past. It definitely leans more towards the doom metal and the desert kind of sound, the stoner metal type of sound that the Melvins have experimented with before, more so than like the hardcore punk kind of elements. But for what it is, I think it's very enjoyable. This type of sound can be easily seen in the first two tracks on this half of this album, Blackheath and Soberdelic, which just have a very sort of, these are the two longest songs on this half of the album, and I believe just out of the entire project in general. They have this kind of long, winding desert sound to them, which, kind of builds up a nice atmosphere for this project, especially having these tracks be right at the beginning and, back to back. It builds up this atmosphere for what you're going to be expecting later on. And like I said, these aren't the heaviest tracks that Melvin have ever made, and they're definitely not, the most in-your-face, aggressive tracks. They're more not atmospheric, I would say, but they provide more of an atmosphere, kind of this doomy, sort of drugged-out atmosphere that I think is rather interesting, and it gives you a nice example of what's to come later on. Though you do have some more sludgier tracks that appear later on in the track listing. Take the third track on the album, Euthanasia, which is just a very hard-hitting, very enjoyable track here. Some of the tracks here on this half of the album, Death, aren't as interesting or not quite as standout as some of, the Melvins' previous works, but, just to kind of, as an album on its own, if you were to take Death on its own and just kind of ignore Love as if Death had been the only thing released here, I think it would just be a very solid entry into the Melvins' discography, because it does have some great standout tracks, but it also has some tracks that are kind of unmemorable and just, are kind of there, to be honest. But they're not bad songs by any means. There's not a track here that I think is bad. They're all enjoyable. They're all tracks that I find are fun to listen to, and they all definitely maintain the same atmosphere that I mentioned was introduced during the first two tracks here, and it doesn't feel disjointed or anything of that sort. It's an enjoyable listen, especially if you're a fan of this band or just this type of music in general, sort of a sludge metal, doom metal kind of sound. You're going to enjoy this project, or rather Death, that is, not maybe so much Love, but you should definitely check out the Death, because you're going to find yourself enjoying it a fair amount. Love, on the other hand, like I said, it's definitely more for the hardcore Melvins fans that are kind of going to be into really whatever they put out, or maybe people that are really into experimental sort of ambient type stuff, because that's really what you're getting there. On the other hand, if you're more of a casual fan, it's maybe not quite for you, because it is, a bit of a chore to get through at times. But overall, my biggest complaint with this project, the entire project as a whole, both of these albums put together, really under this whole double album, is just the fact, like I mentioned earlier, that they are, packaged like this, put out together as this double album. I would have much preferred had they been released as two completely separate albums, because I think that would have been a bit more, beneficial to this band, because now, like I mentioned earlier, I like Death a good amount, but the fact that it's paired up with Love kind of, ruins the whole experience of Death, because it's, paired up with it, something that's so different. And, after listening to Death, I'm not exactly in the mood to listen to Love, honestly, or, just in general, I'm not really in the mood to listen to Love, just given how experimental and sort of weird and, it is, especially without the film that accompanies it. And at the same time, Love is also very different from Death, and let's say you'd be in the mood to listen to Love or something like that. Death doesn't exactly match up with it super well. The only thing that these two albums really have going for them in terms of similarity is definitely sort of a strange, sort of drugged out atmosphere, and sort of, this, I guess you could say that sort of atmosphere works with both these tracks, because, as I mentioned earlier, Death has sort of a stoner metal, kind of doom metal atmosphere, whereas Love has this really weird experimental sort of using sampling from presumably this film, as well as all these other types of weird sounds going in there that just kind of gives off that impression of sort of this drugged out atmosphere. That does definitely connect these two albums, but at the same time, it's not quite strong enough of a connection that I think that these two things should have been bundled and released together under the guise of one big project, because honestly they're so different that, I really don't see why they were put together. I would have much preferred had they been released separately, but that's just my own personal opinion. It doesn't exactly damage the quality of like Death on its own or Love on its own, but ultimately, if you're a Melvins fan, I definitely recommend you check this project out, or at least that is Death, especially, you should check that out. But Love definitely maybe a bit more if you're a hardcore fan, or maybe if you just want to hear what exactly it's about. It's definitely worth checking out in my opinion. Overall, I think that this is a pretty solid effort from the Melvins. Nothing super groundbreaking or nothing super new, with the exception of really Love, which definitely is interesting and experimental, but I just don't think it's the most enjoyable thing in the world. I know some people may agree with me, disagree with me on that, but you know, it's just my opinion overall. Yeah, I think that sums up everything I have to say about this project, so I'm going to wrap things up there before I start rambling. If you enjoyed this video, I'd greatly appreciate it if you leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on future album reviews. Make sure you comment down below your thoughts on this album. What did you think about this project as a whole, maybe the individual parts? How do you think the packaging of putting them together worked out? I greatly appreciate seeing your own opinions on it. Thank you for watching again, and stay golden.